Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending where you are, or good evening, I guess, also. I am John Weeks, a member of the Friends of Multilateralism group, and I would like to welcome you to today's session about next steps in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. And in a few moments, I will turn the proceedings over to today's moderator, Stuart Harbinson. However, Lou and Stuart thought it would be helpful if I were to say a few words about FMG's plan to launch a series of events on subsidies, including on fisheries during 2023 and beyond. Let me briefly explain why we think the time may be right for such a discussion and give a sense of our initial thinking on the scope of this initiative. Recent analysis points to the fact that subsidies and other equivalent actions by governments have moved to the top of the list of measures that put market access for goods at risk, particularly in the largest markets. The past year has seen enormous sums spent by governments, and there is a serious risk that this trend will continue as more and more governments conclude that they must intervene to put their own producers on an even footing with those of other nations. This aggressive spending simply cannot continue. Indeed, governments already recognize the need to focus on ideas for repairing government balance sheets by reducing spending. A collective approach to doing so would offer the prospect of ensuring that all major countries would engage. Smaller and medium-sized countries, which do not have the resources to compete with the big guys, could well see real value in a new effort to strengthen disciplines. Importantly, as the Cairns Group has recognized, there's also a need to renew the effort to discipline agricultural subsidies. Initial soundings undertaken by FMG have revealed an interest in engaging in a wide-ranging discussion of subsidies. Some see this as an urgent task. Few, if any, seem to be opposed to such a discussion. In our initial thinking at FMG, we thought discussion might be organized along the following line. An initial focus could be on economic considerations, including the motivations for governments in offering supports, the cost of such programs to treasuries, as well as their impact on other countries. This could include considerations of the environmental impact of subsidies, but also how subsidies might promote adoption of environmentally friendly measures. A brief description of the analytical work which has been undertaken on subsidies by the WTO, the OECD, and the World Bank. A brief review of the sectoral breadth of industrial subsidies and the availability of data on which governments are most active in providing subsidies. New approaches to tackle agricultural subsidies in the 21st century. Continued work on fisheries subsidies. Government support in services, and examining existing international disciplines on subsidy practices, including the WTO agreements on agriculture, subsidies and countervailing measures, and fisheries subsidies. Such an analysis could include reference to the no longer enforced ASCM provisions in Article 8, which address non-actionable subsidies used in support of research, disadvantaged regions, and adaptation to new environmental requirements. We could begin such a project with an initial overview discussion, and then, depending on the outcome, organize further meetings to go into these matters in more depth. As we continue our preparatory work, FMG would welcome comments as to the best way to proceed, but not today, because today our focus should be on the next steps in the fisheries subsidy negotiations. I thank you for your attention, and I now pass the floor to our moderator for today, Stuart. Over to you, Stuart.
Thanks very much indeed for that, John. I must say I I very much share the concerns you outlined about the current subsidy race. And I think all of us in the Friends of Multilateralism group are grateful to you for taking the initiative to carry forward some of the thinking in this area. And we look forward very much to hearing more about possible future activities in this area. So thanks again. Now turning to today, let me just say, of course, I have to acknowledge the year of the rabbit. And so I want to start by wishing you all Sanin Failok and Gung Hei Fat Choi with my rapidly deteriorating Cantonese. As we all know, MC12 last June was successful in no small part because members were at long last able to reach an agreement on fisheries subsidies. This marked a very significant milestone when one considers that the Doha mandate on fisheries subsidies was over 20 years old. It's also worth remembering, I think, as I do actually from personal experience at the time, that the mandate for clarifying and improving WTO disciplines on fisheries subsidies appears in two places in the Doha Declaration. First under WTO rules, and then again under trade and environment. However, the agreement reached at MC12, while very welcome, was not regarded as being sufficiently comprehensive, as we can see from paragraph 4 of the accompanying ministerial decision. This paragraph calls for continued negotiations on outstanding issues, including on further disciplines on certain forms of fishery subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment should be integral. Not that these outstanding subjects were not addressed in the negotiations. Far from it. They were, of course, very much at the heart of the text going into MC12, W20 in June, and before that, W5 in November 2021. The problem was, of course, that members couldn't reach agreement on these issues during the ministerial conference. So we know that there's no easy solution. The idea behind today's session is to look ahead to the continued negotiations, which unfortunately have not really yet got off the ground since the ministerial conference. What exactly are the deficiencies in the current fishery subsidies agreement? What are the main stumbling blocks in terms of addressing the outstanding issues? And do we have any ideas on how to make concrete progress? Let's remember also that this is becoming urgent because now MC13 is only just over a year away. Fortunately, we have an outstanding panel to help us address these and other issues today. And I really do mean outstanding. I think if you had to choose 3 or 4 people at one shot just to get them together in a room to talk about this subject, then I think these are the people you choose. I'll just introduce them very briefly because I think the details were already circulated in the program. But first, of course, welcome to Angela Ellard. Angela has a hugely impressive experience in international trade, both in Congress and in the private sector. And her current remit as WTO Deputy DG covers the rules area. So there's no one better qualified, I think, than Angela to get us up and running today. Thanks, Angela. Ambassador Wayne McCook is Assistant Secretary General at the Caribbean Community Secretariat and took part in the negotiations at MC12. Before that, I think, as we all know, he was a special advisor to the DG in the WTO. And before that, he was Jamaica's ambassador in Geneva. in which capacity, of course, he was a chair of the Rules Negotiating Group. So again, impeccable credentials, Wayne. Thanks for joining us today. Benedict Fleischer has years of experience working on WTO issues for the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as a negotiator on fisheries subsidies. She's currently Deputy Permanent Representative at the mission in Geneva, and at the same time, I understand, is now chairing the OECD Trade Committee, an appointment I think which speaks for itself in terms of a recognition of expertise. Thanks for joining us, Benedict. And Alice Tipping is the lead on sustainable trade and fisheries subsidies at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. This is complemented by her previous experience in the New Zealand mission to the WTO. And currently, and in recent years, she's designed and directed many research programs and policy dialogues on fisheries subsidies. So we have a star-studded cast, and I'm going to turn to them in a minute. Just to say, in terms of the guidelines, the format is that I'm going to give the floor to each of our speakers in turn for 7 or 8 minutes, after which I may have a follow-up question or two of my own. And then I'll also try to give our speakers an opportunity to react briefly to what the other speakers have said. And we'll try to leave enough time at the end for a good exchange through questions or comments from our very knowledgeable audience today. You can indicate your wish to participate by using the chat or raise hand functions in Zoom. I understand this session is being recorded, as we just heard, but I hope that we can speak as freely as possible and have a genuine conversation. Nothing we say here is set in stone. The whole idea, in fact, is to try to catalyze thoughts and get some leads for the next phase of negotiations, which we all want to succeed. So with that introduction, Angela, could I turn first to you? I think, as I was saying, you more than any of us have an overall perspective from your Secretariat viewpoint on the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Could you perhaps provide us with a pen picture or an assessment of what's been achieved so far and what you think still remains to be done? Over to you. I can't hear you, I'm afraid, Angela. We seem to have a technical problem.
Membership has been a bit.
Stuart, she's fallen off the participants list, so I think she's been cut off. She'll have to dial back in.
I think I can still see Angela, but I can't hear her. Could you dial back in, Angela? I think maybe we could come back to Angela in that case. I'm not sure what's happened there. But maybe we could move on to you, Wayne, if you are ready to go. Of course, we're not asking you, Wayne, to speak on behalf of all developing countries, but that would be unfair because there's so many nuances in positions. But I think the Caribbean countries were very active in the end game at MC12, and you also bring the perspective of a former RNG chair. So could I kick off just by asking you, in your view, whether SDG 14.6 target has been met by the outcome at MC12, and if not, where do you see the deficiencies? Over to you. An easy one.
Thank you, Stuart. And I had anticipated intervening after the stage had been set by DDG Ellard. And I think one of the things in an agreement like this is that it needs to be comprehensive. However, the WTO has a practice of bringing all of its issues, and there are not many because only 2 agreements have been concluded in its existence. But it's brought down to the issue of special and differential treatment, which I think is a strategic error in the negotiating practice of the institution. Once you isolate special and differential treatment as an issue to make or break a negotiation, it forces a negotiation with uneven leverage, but that's for another discussion. To answer your question, I think, and Benedict is coming together with Alice after me, and they will perhaps flesh out some more, a more targeted response to your question as to whether SDG 14.6, which is essentially a sustainability target with trade-related elements assigned to the WTO, whether that has been met. And I think the collective judgment of the WTO is no. That is the reason why the negotiations for a comprehensive agreement have been prioritized. We can have a later discussion on the implications of paragraph 4, why there was an endgame pushed by some members to seek to tie comprehensive outcomes to any outcome, but that's for a further discussion. We should also remember that using SDG 14.6 as a benchmark for the outcome was contested. Many will know, and Benedict may recall, that when we restarted negotiations in 2015, a lot of things that are taken as given in the Geneva outcome were contested in the restart of the negotiations, particularly the deference to FAO instruments. I must say I returned and was pleasantly shocked that the deference to RFMO determinations, which had been contested for their fluidity, was now integrated as a benchmark. So I'm saying that we have to be thankful in terms of the outcomes received in Geneva for the flexibilities that emerged after the startup of the negotiations. And in that regard, the significance of 14.6 as a benchmark for outcome cannot be underestimated. It was the underlying push that got the negotiations going, notwithstanding what I just said about the contestation at the outset. What it means is that its signature focus would have been OCOF, over capacity and overfishing. And it's simple. Capacity drives capability. And if you are to arrest growth in capacity to fish, the downstream effect of that is that you reduce the threat that is faced. The problem with capacity is that it calls for a degree of political will that has not yet been demonstrated, because it means that governments are going to have to accept that conduct has to be changed. And I think the agreement and the negotiations benefited from efforts to grandfather pre-existing adjustments to fishing arrangements by certain members. So the commitments that would have been reflected in the agreement would have been intended to accommodate intentions already resolved in certain members. And I think that is germane when you look at the issue of 5.1.1, which is essentially the deference to management which essentially says if you demonstrate said, because it, of course, it did not survive in the end, but if you demonstrate that you have the management arrangements in place to sustain fishing at an acceptable level, you can subsidize. You know, it's of course a garage door for a truck to drive through. But the flip side of that is special and differential treatment, which would be for those who historically and continuously are limited in the ability to subsidize, lack of fiscal space, particularly in developing countries that are resource challenged. SDT becomes the tool to ensure that they can sustain certain activities and secure future growth in their fisheries. And I think that the striking of that balance is critical to any outcome that is to be achieved. I would probably want to stop there, Stuart, because I think DDG Ellard may be able to come in, and I think we would want to return to a more comprehensive point of departure for the conversation. But I think those 2 points that I've made are intrinsic in any outcome that is to be achieved in the future work. How do you resolve the balance between management and the capability of some to organize and order their fisheries with resources that allow them to do so? And how do you accommodate the concerns of others who do not have that capacity, but need some means of ensuring that they can comply with the disciplines without prejudice to their development agenda and efforts? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wayne, for leaping into the breach there. I'm sorry to drop that on you, but I think you've raised some extremely interesting points in relation to the SDG, and also in particular between the disciplines and special and differential treatment, and this idea that it should be that special and differential treatment is seen as a tool to ensure the possibility of growth in future. That's very, very interesting. And I think it's something we'll come back to. But right now, I'd like to see if Angela is able to join us. I'm sorry about that, Angela. I don't know what happened. But could I ask you now to tell us about your assessment of the agreement at MC12 and what needs to be done in your view? Over to you. I'm afraid still not hearing you. Can anyone else hear Angela? No?
Sorry, Stuart, this is Fernando. Could I suggest Angela to get out and coming back so that
Yeah, let's try that. I think she might have tried that already, actually, but we'll see. Anyway, I think we should move on rather than just waiting. So, Benedict, I think you're with us, and I hope that you can hear us and we can hear you. As we were just discussing with Wayne, the MC12 ministerial decision, paragraph 4, specifically mentioned overcapacity and overfishing with appropriate special and differential treatment as among the subjects to be addressed in continued negotiations. And I'd like to ask you, given your long experience in these negotiations, what are the more specific elements that need to be added to the current fisheries subsidies agreement in these areas of overcapacity and overfishing and special and differential treatment? Over to you, Benedict.
Thank you, Stuart. I hope you hear me. Well, it would have been nice to have Angela's laying the scene, so to speak, beforehand. But let me just say this, that overcapacity, overfishing is the issue we need to tackle. That's what's in front of us. And transparency and special and differential treatment are part of that issue. They're not separate, they're part of it. The way I wanted to address this subject today is by posing some questions of my own. Now, Wayne went into already going into the details of 5.1 and 5.11 and so forth. I thought that for the company today, that maybe we should keep it on a little bit more general level than that. But let me at the outset say that I completely agree with Wayne when he says that the problem of capacity was political will. Some would say that we were very close to reaching an agreement on overcapacity and overfishing based on the text we had in June. Others, of course, would say that it was proven that we were not close because we didn't manage to bridge the gaps. So one of the main questions is, do we go back to the June 2022 text, the pre-MC12 text, or do we go back to other texts and proposals from over 20 years of negotiations, or do we go back to the drawing board? I think there is another essential question to be asked and answered, and then we can look at text. And the question is basically, does any WTO member plan or want to subsidize unsustainable fishing? If the answer is honestly no, as it should be, as I see it, then we have the fundamental basis for an agreement, and we can draw on the parts of the pre-MC12 text. But no de minimis, no 25-year transition period. And I don't say that lightly, because when it comes to, for example, de minimis, Norway was part of that drive to have that in the text. So, other questions? Are you knowingly today subsidizing unsustainable fishing? And I underline knowingly. Then you might need a transition period and possibly technical assistance and capacity building to tackle that. But preferably, put your house in order before entry into force of a new agreement. Are you afraid that you might inadvertently subsidize unsustainable fishing? Then we need a grace period for dispute settlement, but not exemptions from commitments. And of course, possibly you need technical assistance capacity building to tackle that. Do you want the possibility to subsidize in the future? And you know, Wayne, that's part of it. People wanted to keep this, they wanted to have the capacity to subsidize even if they don't subsidize now. But then you have to have measures in place so that the fishing is done sustainably within your own economic zone. You have to ensure that your fishing fleets follows the rules and quotas of whatever RFMO responsibility area you're fishing in. And you have to follow another country's fishing authorities when fishing in that country's EEZ. It sounds pretty simple, but then you get into the detail of what would a text look like. But generally, be transparent about the subsidies and measures in place. Be willing to put evidence on the table to demonstrate. And that goes to what Wayne was talking about in 5.11. Many members are afraid that the dispute settlement system and whether and how individual members' fishery management would be under scrutiny for its sustainability. It would help, and this is trying to look at what can we do now. It would help if it was made clear in the text what evidence would be expected, taking direction from the pre-MC12 text, but perhaps clarifying more, and perhaps also making a distinction between the largest fishing nations and subsidizers and the smaller ones. Do we want or need exceptions? We had exceptions for LDCs in the text, and there was a call for exempting artisanal fishing. We never got to the bottom of that. However, assuming subsidization, if LDC or artisanal waters are overfished, a member needs to put in measures even if they don't withdraw the subsidies, or they should redirect or repurpose the subsidies. Otherwise, consequences will be ruinous for the artisanal or the LDC and or LDC fishers for whom the subsidies were supposed to help. We have to get around that. So if we have exceptions to rules, it's either because governments can't implement the commitments for capacity reasons, it being too difficult, or because implementation would be detrimental or too costly compared to the benefits of adhering to the commitments. We've heard, by the way, a lot about that concerning transparency and smaller developing countries, including both in the Caribbean and the Pacific area, or that commitments are just not needed. The member is not part of the problem. But is the member not part of the problem because they're not subsidizing? Or is the member not part of the problem because they're not big enough? And that was, how we tried to get in through the de minimis. But maybe we should take a step back from that again. Needs or readiness assessments seem to be the way to go in various negotiations. Alice has done a lot on that, but we're doing it in the investment facilitation for development negotiations. We've done it on the TF negotiations. There are a lot of e-com readiness or being done by UNCTAD. So this is going on, and maybe we should be looking at this here too on overcapacity overfishing. Each member should assess whether they are or can subsidize sustainable fishing, and the elements to be assessed being their fishing capacity and fleet, where and what they fish, and I'm talking about assessments they have to do themselves, their fisheries management, including what bilateral or regional arrangements they're part of, their subsidies, and plans for development of their fisheries industry. And that's really important because this has to do with increasing their capacity. Based on that assessment, they'll gain insight in whether they can implement an agreement immediately or what measures need to be put in place and how. We have the fund to be used by or for developing members, which is both a financial mechanism, but not least a cooperation mechanism that brings the FAO, World Bank, and others into the equation to address fisheries holistically. And let's build on that. So, well, to conclude, I think we have the basis for further negotiations in our pre-MC12 June 2022 text. But I also think members have to rethink what they really want. Hopefully sustainable fishing, and what they can do themselves and what they might need of help to attain their common goals. Now, as you can understand, I've sort of written this down, but I was sitting here looking at what, and I really feel passionately about this negotiation. But these are, the questions we really need to look at, each and every one of us, and then I think we can go back and have meaningful negotiation on overcapacity and overfishing. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Benedict. And you threw so many interesting issues out there, and I'm not nearly as familiar as you are with this very complex subject matter. So forgive me, but I thought you said at one point that you thought there shouldn't be a sort of de minimis in this area. But then you were saying, rightly, I thought, in my own personal view, that we do have the basis for an agreement, and one of the things we should be working on was the June text, which of course did have a provision for de minimis. So that's probably my own misunderstanding. But could you just say a few words more on that?
Yes, certainly. Now, you have various elements in the June text, of which one of them, yes, is so-called 5.5, I think it was, and the de minimis was part of that, including the 25-year transition period for those who were not under the de minimis. I think we have to, just as Wayne said, don't concentrate at the outset on the special and differential treatment part, but look at the rules. And the question is, are the rules that we put in 5.1 and 5.11 and so forth, are they good enough? Could we do this in another manner, which would give comfort to developing countries, especially the smaller ones, but do not necessarily say that you are totally exempted out of this until you perhaps reach a certain level of production. So I would like us to perhaps, refocus. Special and differential treatment is part of the equation, but refocus it to see what rules would accommodate at the same time as I would be sure that the subsidies I would want to or are using are not detrimental to the fisheries. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer.
Yeah, got it. Thanks very much. I'm sorry that I was a bit slow on the uptake there. So thanks very much. That was great, Benedict, and you raised a lot of very, very interesting issues, which I'm sure we'll also come back to you. Now, Angela, I'm hoping third time lucky, and if you could possibly give us your overview, that would be extremely welcome.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. I changed venues. Sometimes that's all it takes. We tried restarting and it still wasn't working. So I'm glad to be with you all this afternoon. And I listened to Wayne and Benedicta's comments and I found them very, very interesting, very insightful. And I have to say what a tremendous pleasure it is to be on this panel with them, with Alice as well. They were huge forces behind getting this agreement done. And I know we have much more work to do, but every now and then I think we should revel in the fact that we were able to accomplish this, that our members were able to bring this together. This event today is enormously timely because we are just over a year away, 13 months away from MC13. It's going to be now the week of February 26th, 2024. It sounds like a long way away, but that time will be eaten up very quickly. So we have a lot of work to do between now and then. Several types of work. One aspect of that work relates to the agreement that's already been concluded. And that would involve, of course, entry into force. We need to have 2/3 of members deposit their instruments of acceptance for the agreement to enter into force. Last week, Switzerland was number one, deposited its instruments in a ceremony that at Davos. And so we're hoping that that primes the pump, that it breaks the logjam, and that others will follow suit. I know that many of our members have are very far along in taking the steps that are necessary. And sometimes it's more complex than we want it to be because of the legal nature of this, and that it's often not the trade people who have to undertake these steps. Sometimes it can involve legislatures. Coming from a legislative background, I know exactly how hard that can be sometimes. But still, we are hoping in the next few months to reach the point where we can have this agreement enter into force. So that's one stream of work. In addition to that, while we're preparing for the second wave, beginning the second wave, we have to be ready for the actual entry into force itself. Because on day one, when this agreement enters into effect, the expectation is that all members will be in a position to implement. In other words, there's no transition period for the major provisions in the agreement. Although, of course, there is some special and differential treatment for a period of time that is permitted. But these obligations are a bit different from the usual subsidies obligations. And they also pertain to things like notifications about fisheries subsidies, about fisheries management. And those are a little bit different than the usual types of notifications that have to be made. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in a preparatory way to be ready for entry into force. To help developing countries with this, we have established a fund for providing technical assistance and capacity building for developing countries and the least developed. So this fund was envisioned in the agreement. It was established in the agreement in Article 7. And at the same time, we have already taken care of the procedural elements that needed to be done here at the WTO. So notifying our budget committee and preparing a very detailed concept note that would set forth the circumstances, set forth the nature of this fund. Working with our partners, the FAO, the OECD, for example, to make sure that we're able to take advantage of their expertise and to be able to leverage our own expertise here in the WTO. We're not a fisheries management organization, but we have a lot of expertise on subsidies. So we want to have this fund operational, populated with cold hard cash. And a number of our members have made pledges we're hoping to convert in the not too distant future. So that is the type of work that's underway right now with respect to the first wave. Then there's the second wave. I just want to make one comment here in light of some of the things that have been said, the difference between the first and the second. The first agreement is a fully freestanding agreement, a binding agreement. And once the entry into force occurs, we have meaningful obligations. But there is definitely the sense, the very strong sense from our members that we do need to do more. And so that is a separate wave of negotiations, but it is not, it would be presumably a second agreement, or depending on what the members decide, how that agreement would live, how it would exist legally. The fact is that what our members have agreed to at this point is its own freestanding agreement. Now, the second wave of negotiations, it's a very interesting concept of the way that has been launched and the way it's been envisioned. I think, Stuart, as you pointed out, in the agreement that exists now, there is a clause that says that after 4 years, if comprehensive provisions are not agreed to, then the existing agreement would terminate. this was quite an extraordinary step, I think, for the members to take. It, in my view, because the consequence of not reaching a comprehensive agreement is so draconian that this agreement would go away, I think that creates huge incentives for our members to make sure that never happens, and that they will work, as I fully believe, in good faith to achieve a second wave, a comprehensive set of provisions. So the sunset clause, the termination clause, call it what you will, is, in my view, not to be seen as a negative. I think some initially thought, wait, you've built something into this agreement, a self-destruct clause. But it's really not that. It's creating an incentive, I think a very powerful incentive for the second wave of negotiations. There's a lot to be done with respect to that second wave. And I think that Benedicta and Wayne certainly laid out some of the issues that need to be considered. We'll have to see how members want to play this. I'm excited that we have the very real prospect now of having a chair of the negotiating group on rules as soon as tomorrow, depending on how the members, what happens at a 9 o'clock meeting that's been called tomorrow. But if that is the case, and it's very much my hope, then we can really begin our formal work. In the meantime, though, we haven't been sitting on our hands. I think our members have been quite active. We had a retreat back in October where our members spent a day discussing the ins and outs, hearing from different speakers about how the second wave of negotiations should be conducted. So we're not starting from scratch. In addition to that, at our members' request, we had 2 sessions. We have 2 sessions, workshops. We had one last year, at the very end of last year, focusing on how we got to where we are and what could come next. And then next week, we'll have a session on data, which is a very, very important element of this whole exercise, both in terms of fisheries subsidies, as well as management, fisheries management in general. How do we provide, how do we collect the data here? How do members provide it? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the success stories? Really getting down to the nitty gritty, looking at a variety of perspectives to try to move this forward. So now that we are getting close to having a formal structure, I'm hoping that we can conduct our work. I would conclude with a statistic that really has struck me as giving the context for the importance of the work that we're engaged in. As you all know, by some measures, nearly half of assessed fish stocks are overfished. This is down from 10% in the 1970s and about 18% when the negotiations were launched that took 21 years. So we're now at the point where nearly half are overfished. $22 billion worth of fisheries subsidies are provided every year. Harmful fish subsidies are provided every year. Contrast that with this statistic, that between 2010 and 2020, so over a 10-year period, various donors provided $5 billion in assistance, technical assistance in the fisheries sector, 65% in sustainable fishing. $5 billion over 10 years in technical assistance compared to 22 billion in fisheries subsidies. If we were able to convert that 22 billion to assistance to good subsidies, sustainable subsidies, efforts at fisheries management, what a difference our members could make with respect to the health of the ocean, of fisheries stocks, helping those who depend on them, both for livelihood and as a source of protein. So sorry again for my false start, but I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Angela, and so pleased that we managed to be able to get that in the end. It was great, and I think you delivered a reasonably upbeat message. I noted and agreed very much with your comment that, you know, sometimes we have to appreciate what we've managed to achieve and not concentrate on shortcomings that some might see there. So, of course, as strong supporters of the system, I'm sure all of our friends of multilateralism will be fully with you on that one. And also, it was good to hear that we're almost in the situation of having a new chair for the rules negotiating group. Maybe if we postponed this meeting by a week, we might have been able to have a new chair as well. But I'm sure we'll get him or her at an appropriate point. And those figures you gave us for subsidies and technical assistance are something to ponder on, I think, aren't they? Yeah, very good. Thank you. Let's go to Alice now. Alice has been waiting patiently, I see there. But I think the great thing about having Alice on the call is that, you know, she's not in the institution or in the delegations, but she's coming at this from a more non-governmental and sustainable development perspective. So I'd be very interested to know, Alice, how you evaluated the MC12 outcome. And also, since you're more kind of in the ideas area, you know, in addition to using W5 and W20 as a basis for continued negotiations, are there any other creative ideas out there that, in your view, could be explored to make the fisheries subsidies agreement more comprehensive than it now is? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stuart. And thanks, of course, to the Friends of Multilateralism for the opportunity to join this discussion. I am one among a group of stars, and they are much more stars than I am. But listen, as other people have said, we at ISD have been following the fisheries negotiations for a very long time. And our role, essentially, as we've seen it, has been to help delegations understand their options and to understand the evidence, and as best we can to help to frame some of their decisions in ways that are clear and constructive, and help them build the best possible agreement that is politically feasible. And we say politically feasible because we are very aware of just how difficult it is to reach agreement on these things. And here, you know, I think I have to agree sort of with both Angela and with Wayne. I'm not sure we are entirely there on 14.6. I'm not sure we've really met that mandate in toto, and that's why we have the second wave of negotiations. But that said, we, having sat sort of with the delegates, albeit outside the rooms, for so many months and so many years, know just how difficult it was to get to the agreement that was reached in June. And I still firmly think that the governments that achieved that degree of consensus should be congratulated for it. This is only the second multilateral trade agreement we've seen come out of the WTO ever. And it is still the first multilateral agreement with an environmental objective. And that has to be kept in mind always. You know, I've conscious of kind of the reorganization a bit of the order of interventions. I thought I would actually start just by filling the audience in on a little piece that might have been that they'll find useful when they think back to the things that Wayne and Benedicta were saying. And I think those are all exactly the right questions. And that's just to remind ourselves of exactly where we were in the discussion of the overcapacity and overfishing disciplines going into the ministerial. Because I'll start with that, and then I'll talk about some of the other ideas that have been in the mix along the way, just to give people a sense of what sort of options had been shuffled around in the deck of cards. And I suspect most of the people on this call are very familiar with trade negotiations. So when I talk about capping and quantitative limits and sort of reduction quotas, that they'll get it. So I won't go into the details on what that means, but I'll give you a sense of the ideas. So where were we going into the ministerial on the overcapacity and overfishing disciplines? Now, of course, some of the overcapacity and overfishing disciplines remained in the text. There's a firm prohibition on subsidies to fishing in the unregulated high seas, and there's sort of extra caution requirements when subsidies are provided to reflag vessels or when the status of stocks is unknown. So those elements are there. But of course, as Wayne was saying, where we couldn't reach agreement, where members couldn't reach agreement, was on the core prohibition that was going to be the part of the overcapacity and overfishing article. So where were we at that point? So going into the ministerial, essentially the design of the disciplines was a broad prohibition. So members may not provide subsidies contributing to overcapacity and overfishing, including a specific list of some kinds of subsidies that was sort of presumed essentially to be ones that contributed to overcapacity and overfishing. So that was a list approach. People familiar with subsidies will understand. But importantly, and this is where the references to 511 come in. So 511 was a qualifier to that list, essentially allowing members to provide those subsidies if they had measures in place to keep stocks at a biologically sustainable level, if they had fisheries management in place. And so that was essentially the structure of the main prohibition, right? And so from that, there were, in addition, a number of proposed exemptions from that rule with its qualifier, proposed special and differential treatment exemptions. And they were a transition period for subsidies to commercial fishing. So when Benedicta referred to 25 years, she was referring to probably one of the higher requests in terms of how long that transition period for subsidies to commercial fishing would be. There was a proposal for a permanent exemption from the prohibition for subsidies to artisanal fishing, but with artisanal described with sort of socioeconomic qualifiers and within a geographic area. That was under hot dispute, how big that geographical area would be. There was the idea of a permanent exemption from that prohibition for members that represented a de minimis amount of global catch. This is the point Benedicta was making about the de minimis idea, right? So the idea was all members that were responsible for less than X% of global catch would not have to abide by the prohibition in Article 5.1. And then the last permanent exemption was for least developed country members, right? The important thing, I think, to always remember is that all of those special and differential treatment exemptions were exemptions from the prohibition with the qualifier. So it essentially meant that developing countries that fit one of those criteria would not have to prove they had fisheries management in place if they wanted to subsidize. That was the nature of the exemption given, or the result of those exemptions given the nature of the prohibition and how it was structured. And I think that's an interesting thing to remember in the context of some of the questions that Benedicta was asking. So maybe just sort of a quick review of how we got to there. There were a number of other ideas on the table, right? And I think this is, we ISD ran a session back in December where essentially we were sort of reminding everyone who came, and the slides are on our website if you want to have a look at them, but reminding us all of the various ideas we shuffled through before we got to this prohibition with a list and the fisheries management qualifier, something that's been called the hybrid approach. So, in addition, instead of having a positive list of subsidies, some members would have preferred a negative list construction, which confusingly doesn't mean the subsidies listed are negative. It means that all subsidies are prohibited except for some good subsidies that would have been listed. And the challenge with creating any list of subsidies, as all of you will well know, is exactly what is bad in every context and exactly what is good in every context. And how do you develop a way of tailoring slightly what can otherwise be a very static list? Other members had suggested, well, what if we choose an approach that some people will remember from the CPTPP, which is more of an effects-based approach. What if we prohibit only subsidies that actually have in practice the effect of contributing to overcapacity and overfishing? Beautifully tailored, perfectly meets the mandate, difficult to enforce, I think, once you got to a dispute settlement situation. So that was sort of put to one side, but technically it's still on the table. Other members would have focused on situations of overfishing or overcapacity and said any subsidy in that situation is prohibited. So there were a number of different approaches to how we craft this basic prohibition. In the end, the key hybrid approach was what appeared in the chair's text, a list of prohibited subsidies with a fisheries management qualifier attached to it. And of course, as you see on the SNDT side, there are a number of different exceptions modulated into that which would have applied to this kind of qualitative prohibition. And so that's essentially how the exemptions were crafted. But there were ideas on the table as well that would have applied not a qualitative prohibition on some kinds of subsidies in some circumstances, but quantitative limits, right? There were a number of proposals on the table for caps on subsidies. Some would have applied permanent caps, either default measures or as negotiated amongst members, to be the same sort of in perpetuity unless they were renegotiated. But there were also proposals for quantitative limits that, like the non-agricultural market access ideas way back when, would have had automatic ratchets downwards in the quantum of subsidies and larger ratchets downwards for the larger subsidizers, right? Because I think there was, and I sense there still is, a concern that focusing the prohibition too much on whether or not you have management creates a whole argument about management and technical capacity and building capacity for management, and doesn't necessarily get at reducing the quantum of subsidies, which for some members is still important. So we had qualitative ideas, we had quantitative ideas. In the end, what seemed to attract more consensus was this idea of a qualitative prohibition and a management qualifier to it. And so again, you'll see in the kinds of exemptions that were on the table, there were exemptions for defined country groups, for least developed countries, for example. There were also, interestingly, these ideas of exceptions for groups of members defined by particular thresholds, right? And there was this de minimis threshold. There were along the way some suggestions that there should be an upper bound on the developing countries that could access SNDT, right? There were some proposals that would have exempted from SNDT developing countries with more than a certain amount of catch. So there were different ways of kind of slicing and dicing, in a way, sort of the developing country grouping according to catch to apply SNDT to them differently. And as you've seen, there was a distinction drawn between artisanal fishing and commercial fishing. And one thing I think is very interesting is that the idea of a transition period for commercial fishing, right? That that eventually all subsidies to commercial fishing would end up being covered by the prohibition. It's just a question of how long that would take. That eventually was more or less the grounds sort of for agreement. What was remaining was a difficult discussion on how long that transition period would be. And so I think there were lots of variables that came together in trying to define the balance between the prohibition and the balance and the SNDT exemptions. And here I come back to the balance that I think Wayne was talking about, and I think he's exactly right. It's a balance between what we expect of developed countries and how much they are prepared to change the way that they subsidize and how much the members expect them to do that, versus what sort of changes developing country members are prepared to do. And whether it's linked to management or whether it's independent of that, whether artisanal requires special treatment, and if so, how. And I think all of that delicate balance is at once a real question of capacity and fishing capacity, but it's also a question of political fairness, right? And I think the need for a political balance between what developed and developing countries were expected to do was, I think, as important as the actual nature of the policy changes the treaty required. And that, I think, is still the balance that stands in front of us to resolve. I hope that's been a bit helpful. I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Alice, indeed. I think to broaden our horizons a little bit beyond the, the texts that we've had more recently, and think about ideas such as capping and other approaches as well. And also this relationship that you touched on between, what we should expect from the developed countries and the major fishing nations, and what changes its developing countries are prepared to do. I think on that last point, I mean, Wayne said at the beginning, I thought that, if I got him correctly, that one of the problems with the negotiation was that, special and differential treatment was kind of isolated as a sort of internal SDT issue, which turned into a sort of make or break issue, as he put it. Whereas in fact, it's, the whole thing is all together. And I think you just said that as well, Alice. It's this balance idea. So Wayne, can I come back to you and see if you'd like to say a little bit more on this? Because I think you also mentioned special and differential treatment as a tool to ensure the possibility of growth for developing countries in this industry. Whereas I thought, maybe I'm being unkind here, but I thought Benedict was sort of saying no. But maybe she wasn't saying no. Perhaps she was saying that only in a sustainable way. But let me come back to you first, Wayne, for any further thoughts you've got on that, and then I'll come to you, Benedict, as well.
Thanks, Stuart. And I'm conscious that I'm not yet in academia, so I may be somewhat circumscribed because our region has certain positions, and but whatever I say now is not reflective of the position of the Caribbean community. So let me, of course, it's informed by exposure to it, but it's not reflective of that. In WIPO IP negotiations, you approach the issue of exceptions and limitations as a sort of third rail discussion of most negotiations. In the WTO, it's SDT. But SDT looked at as really in the body of exceptions and limitations, allows a certain perspective. Why and in what conditions would you allow exceptions from a discipline that all feel should be undertaken? And so that's the perspective I think that one would take to whether developed or developing country exceptions. And I'm using exceptions to get away from the trigger words that we know well. So exceptions and limitations. So in that regard, I'm sympathetic to elements of Benedict's perspective. But I think there's a particular perspective that comes from being an actual developing country, seeking to bind your policy space in an external forum. And the experience of developing countries, especially small developing countries, is that these mechanisms are not their friends. And most of them are exercised this ex machina. If you look at what happens out of the Washington Consensus, you're told, here are the conditions under which you apply your policies, even though you are sovereign. So when you have the option, and the WTO is in a peculiar position in that these are not handed down, these are agreed. And so developing countries now have to approach the responsibility they're given to shape the framework within which they make current and future policy in the ways that are prudent and foreseeable to them. And so I think, but to step back from that to the key elements that remained in contest in what I thought was almost as good as it could get in a framework for an outcome, which is Article 5. However you slice and dice it, you're going to come back to those elements. will management, which by its very objective should be designed to maintain sustainable fishing, because no member wishes to fish themselves out of fisheries. There's an intrinsic value to managing your fish stocks sustainably. And when I talk to colleagues in our region, that's the same motivation they have. And that is what animates their engagement in the FAO discussions on fisheries from its as a sectoral matter. Bring that over to the WTO. What do you want? You want to discipline a small slice of the pie of sustainable fishing. IUU enforcement through other means is part of it, but the subsidies have a peculiar role in the fishing outcomes that are of concern. So we focus narrowly on that. Now, for many developing countries, subsidies, because of lack of fiscal space, is something that they would wish to do and cannot afford. So the experience of actually subsidizing is more limited than developed countries and high-performing developing countries who, by virtue of the size of their fishing activity, can justify high investments and also high levels of subsidies. So I think if you look at it in that context, when you look at transition, there's an objective conversation to be had about transition. Transition to what? And if you're transitioning to something that is linked to effective implementation, what are the roadmap, what are the landmarks on that way? So if a member says, I need 25 years to set up inspection stations in 1,000 points, that member should be able to say what it would take based on their foreseeable planning to do so. What we did in the TF agreement to say, let's build in certain sensors, so to speak, on the path to that acquisition of capacity. Because transition has to be purposeful. Now, geographical exception and level of fishing activity and fishing outcome limitations, that is de minimis. The objective question is, at what level is de minimis truly de minimis? That is, it's so low that it would cost more to discipline it than to simply say, when you cross that threshold, you change gears. And I want to stop here because I think there are other perspectives that can be brought to bear on it, but I don't think you will have an outcome absent some simplified version of affording policy space to those members who foresee the need to support fishing activity, albeit sustainably, in the future, if that is 0.05%, or 0.01 or 0.1, that can come out in the mix. The benefit of the reset of the negotiations is that a set of significant policy questions can be discussed without the extraordinary pressure of a last-minute negotiation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Wayne. That's really very interesting. I understand you were speaking in your personal capacity there, I'll say. But yeah, the idea I think that you implanted there was that it's perhaps difficult, for some developing countries to accept that the developed countries have been subsidizing all this time, and then suddenly the tap is turned off for everybody, and developing countries that might have the potential for a fishing industry and are not able to develop that, even if they would do so in a sustainable way. I'm not sure, but that's what I took from what you said. Benedict, maybe you would like to come in on this point.
Thank you, Stuart. You know, Wayne is a wise man, and I can't go against what he says. I wanted to pick up perhaps a couple of issues, and what also Alice said, starting out with the issue of political fairness. That's a difficult one, and we're really sensitive to the fact that yes, you have many developed, but also developing fishery nations who have, you know, subsidized quite a lot and are still subsidizing. So why they, if they're not willing to bind themselves, reduce, cut, reduce, eliminate, why should we do it? On the other hand, we have the global commons, and if I continue to subsidize, but I'm doing it in a fishery management and doing it so-called sustainably, it's not going to help you that you do not do the same if you are overfishing. So you have to curb the incentive of, if you do subsidize, to do it unsustainably. Now, when there was a lot of talk the last few months, perhaps the last few years, about reverse special and differential treatment, giving those developed country members who actually have a fishery management, that they could continue to have, in a sense, a policy space to subsidize, while others needed to curb their policy space. And that's where it emanates the idea that for those members, you really need to, if you can't get them, because it's so politically difficult, to reduce your subsidies, cut them, eliminate them, then okay, let's look hard at the qualifiers on if you subsidize, you really need to demonstrate this, that, and the other. The problem with the negotiations was that at the same time, you wanted to bring in developing countries who might not have the same capacity, but be able to use that exceptional qualifier, or whatever you would call it, as well. So it became more fluffy. Is there a possibility to narrow it down, to make it more stringent, more clear, but at the same time, looking at it from the other side, where you don't have as much, your fishery management is different based on other qualifiers. Your demonstration, your level of possibly demonstrating is of another level, but managing to do this at the same time. That is one way of trying to tackle it. But I do take the point that maybe we should go back to that transition period. I'd only like to say one qualifier on that is that we've thought of, you know, we haven't really delved into it, but we've thought of looking at the TF way of doing this. The problem with that is that you have competition between neighbors. You have competition within regions. And if one of your competitors is actually is allowed to do things, has a longer transition period, for example, than what you yourself have put in as what you need, then you are not having a level playing field. So what do you do there? So there are many difficulties, but again, I think, yes, they are in that package that we have in front of us on the table. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Benedict. I'll sort of turn to the audience now. I don't know, I can't see any questions in the chat or any hands up, but please do put a question in the chat or or raise your hand if anybody on the call wants to direct a question to the panel as a whole or to anyone in particular. The floor is definitely open for that. In the meantime, while we're waiting for people to spark, I see Jonathan, you've got your hand up. Could you please go
Sure.
ahead?
Sure. Well, thanks to everyone. Very rich, very detailed. I do hope at least those of us in FMG have later access to the recording because there's a lot to digest. But let me ask, and in particular, Angela and Alice, who highlighted this, to put this back into context, because it's the fisheries management organizations. It's a range of policies beyond the overcapacity subsidies that affect the sustainability of fisheries, the environmental aspects, the nutrition, the entire ecosystem of the oceans, and so on. And even a second round of negotiations runs the risk of being a little too incestuous without broadening the context if the ultimate goal is the sustainability of fisheries for developing artisanal and commercial alike for future generations. So I'd welcome observations on, I guess, what may involve interinstitutional cooperation internationally and certainly interministerial cooperation between trade and environment and fisheries ministries domestically as well. It was a theme, but I think it needs to be brought out a little more. So just to invite observations and comments, and I don't mean to limit it to Alice and Angela, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And Angela, would you like to have a go at that one?
Sure. Hi, Jonathan. Great to see you. I think that's an excellent question, and this is really the innovation of this particular agreement. Environmental sustainability at its core, looking at subsidies not in the traditional way of looking at trade subsidies as in the SCM agreement, but looking at subsidies from an environmental perspective. The other aspect of this is dealing with the ocean and fish stocks as a global, a common good. So this is a problem of the global commons. As a result, the WTO has to partner with those who have expertise in some of these other areas when it comes to helping developing countries in particular with fisheries management questions and issues. Another innovation of this agreement relates to the notifications, the data that's being collected. The data that's out there on fisheries subsidies is it's not the same as looking at data on global catch. Let's put it that way. It's a little bit more subjective. There are huge holes in information. And I think what's so important about this agreement is that there is a recognition and an understanding among our members, large and small, developed and developing, that we need to build this database on subsidies and relating on subsidies and on catch that hasn't really been consolidated in the way we really need to see. And this kind of gets at some of the problems that Benedicta was mentioning, you know, when you have neighboring countries who have very different practices, or perhaps have an arrangement with another member to fish in their waters. It creates different incentives. Having as much information as possible to be able to look at what's really happening will help us, I think, as we're developing and improving on the rules that we have in the first agreement and now on the second wave. Because another element of the first agreement is not only have we built in an agenda, but we also have a review mechanism for what's in the first agreement. So I think that this is what makes this agreement so exciting, is that it covers more. And I think for that reason, among others, it really is such a success for the WTO and for multilateralism. For the first time, being able to capture this concept of the global commons in a legally binding way.
I know we're up against time. Thank you. And I don't mean to interrupt Alice. All I'm getting at, I guess, is imagine totally a comprehensive fisheries subsidies agreement, all subsidies everywhere that contribute to overcapacity on an agreed definition is agreed. That global agreement may not succeed in contributing to sustainable fisheries without all the accompanying policies that have to flow from fisheries organizations and so on. That's the context I'm grappling. Anyway.
Alice, would you like to jump in on that?
I will just briefly, and in fact, I wanted to use the excuse of Jonathan's question. Hi, Jonathan. To use the excuse of Jonathan's question, maybe just to focus on sort of the other perspective of what this treaty can do for governments. And I think until now we've been talking, and I was talking very much about sort of the international fairness of what large fishing nations and small fishing nations do. And that sense of, again, everyone's contribution to the global problem and everyone's contribution to resolving the global problem has animated a lot of these negotiations. But frankly, if you think about sort of sustainability and what this agreement does at a local level, I think just as importantly, we need to be thinking about what this treaty does in terms of shaping countries' own subsidy and fisheries management policies purely for their own benefit, right? Purely, even if it was just sort of subsidies and management within their own exclusive economic zone. You know, and even ignoring subsidies' effects on everyone else, we know from evidence that fisheries management is often poor. And Jonathan, you're absolutely right. We will need better fisheries management to get fisheries back to sustainable profitability. We can't do all of that fisheries management in the WTO, right? So that is where I think, you know, the fisheries fund that's being established in the WTO will pull in expertise from the FAO and the World Bank in doing that. What we can do in this treaty is think about subsidies and subsidy reform. And a perspective that I sometimes feel is not as strong as it should be in this negotiation is what can this treaty help me to do, me as a individual WTO member, in terms of shifting the direction that my subsidies are going in. Because if we really do want to use this treaty to improve the sustainability of our own fisheries for our own coastal communities, their nutrition, their food security, their employment, their livelihoods, all of that, I think the long-term direction of what subsidy reform needs to look like is clear. And from the developing countries that I've been speaking to, it's very clear to them too, right? In the short term, capacity enhancing subsidies are one of the only policy tools they feel they have to get to achieve short-term, immediate social policy objectives. Fine. But you will only achieve those social policy objectives in the long term if you do gradually change the shape of your subsidies from ones that increase capacity to ones that increase sustainable fishing. So I think that perspective tends to get lost, I suspect, in the negotiations, and it's one that I just wanted to put back out there into the discussion. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Alice. We have a question. I know we're up against the time now, so maybe we can go on for a few minutes if the panelists are still available. I don't think we can go on for too long, but anyway, 5 minutes or so. There's a question from Ambassador Matthew Wilson, who says, does the panel feel that the recent drive towards green and sustainable subsidies will have an impact on how we look at future-proofing incentive space for small countries looking forward, i.e. not constraining future possibilities of subsidies. That's in the chat if you want to look at it. Would one of the panelists like to go on that one? Benedict? I'm not forcing you to.
Yeah. No, I was wondering when that question would come up, because having negotiated this for over 20 years, you've seen that policies have changed. You have seen policies in general changed, including on globalization, and you have seen how various members have changed their policy on the trade and fisheries side. So today, we're in a pretty different place from where we were 20 years ago. And is that also one of the options that we're going to perhaps look at? Yes, go back and look at the issue of good or green subsidies. We could very well end up, at least in parts, doing that. I just want to also say that on 14.6, and this is going back to Jonathan's question, we're doing our part. It's not the biggest part of the whole fishery resources area. It's our small part, but of course, looking at it in a holistic manner is extremely important. I was saying the issue about transparency and cooperation, best practices. Even just getting the first wave, the first fishery subsidies agreement on the table, we're going to be looking at best practices in transparency and so forth. That is a plus in itself and will help. And yeah, and just to say, going back, the fact that we got it as a sustainable development target, that was really the help we needed to get moving again, even if it has taken time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Benedict. Yeah, I must say the ambassador's question is very interesting because obviously we seem to be engaged in a subsidies race now, green subsidies race. We're seeing that in all sorts of areas. John Weeks talked about the subsidies race at the beginning of the session, and then where do small developing countries stand in this situation? But we have another comment from Ernesto Hernandez, also in the chat, who just wanted to mention that there is a trend multilaterally to address subsidies harmful to the environment. We have the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, and last December at CBD, there is a specific target to target subsidies harmful to biodiversity. So we have another reason out there to improve the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. I think that's a comment rather than a question. Wayne, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
No, I think a good point has come up about the WTO not being missing in action in a problem that's much bigger than trade policy. And I remember having a conversation with ministers of agriculture and fisheries about the Al Capone dimension, following the money. Subsidies, given their contribution to the activity in question, can be addressed, say in IUU fishing. The normal procedure is to impound the vessel and lay a fine. With the agreement in place, and Benedict is probably most familiar with this, having facilitated the discussion on IUU, what we are, because the question is what value would the agreement bring to a member? And we have to remember that the trigger in 2015 came largely from small developing countries and one major region. And the question I asked then was, what motivates the demanders? And critical in that was the concern of concern of coastal states. And linked to that was the efficacy of an outcome on IUU related subsidies disciplines. And I think as we proceed, the question is, what net value does the binding that a member does bring to that member? And I know we talk about the global commons, but all politics is local. And so that question remains important. And I think the final point on the way forward would be, besides ensuring that there's something in it for each member, is to recognize, and I think Matthew's question touched on this, the ubiquity of trade. This discussion about trade being linked to sustainability, it's almost a truism. Trade is connected to every area of economic activity. The question to be asked is, where do we need rules to address aspects of trade's connection with these activities? And that is the question for the WTO. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. Well, I think really, unfortunately, our time is up. It'd be great if we could go on, but I don't think we can trespass on everybody's time too long. I mean, the thing that struck me is that we've basically just scratched the very surface of a lot of very deep thinking and fantastic experience in this area on behalf of our panelists. And you know, I just wish we could have them back every week and we could go a bit more into detail on all of these issues. It's been, as you know, everybody says, it's been a rich discussion, but this really has been a rich discussion because of the knowledge of the panelists. So heartfelt thanks to them. I don't think I can sum up in any way. Really, I can't. I mean, there's been so many strands to it, but I just noted, and I noted this before the session actually, that the elements that had been left out of the June 2022 text, as compared with the outcome at MC12, well, are the disciplines on overcapacity and overfishing, together with the qualifier on management that Alice mentioned. Secondly, areas belong beyond national jurisdiction, which we didn't get into today, I think, because we just didn't have time. And then thirdly, the huge question of special and differential treatment, which is, as Wayne reminded us, is not a standalone issue, it's linked to everything else. I'll just leave it at that. But then we also, these are not, you know, the only things we need to be talking about in terms of the second wave, as Angela calls it, but also Alice reminded us that there are other ideas still out there, and she mentioned capping and quantitative limits and effects-based issues and measurements as well. So there's a huge amount in this area. So I think we have to leave it at that because we are over time, but I'd like to thank again the panelists for really excellent contributions, and to all of the participants for joining in. And final word is that going back to what John Weeks said at the beginning, if anybody on the call has any views or comments or suggestions for the Friends of Multilateralism group future work on subsidies more generally, then please get in touch with John or me or our CEO, Lou Xiangkun. So with that, I wish you all the best, and I'll close the session now. Thanks again. Goodbye.